Hello, guys and gals, and welcome, welcome to another episode of Unique Items. Today we're going to be going over one of the first uniques that I ever found, but it's been changed significantly from that original video. One of my first unique item videos for Diablo 4, it was the Butcher's Cleaver. The Butcher's Cleaver is a odd unique. Definitely kind of suffered a little bit, especially since they based it around fears, which most people don't like fears. Like, well, you usually want the monsters to come to you. You don't want them to run away from you. But let's talk about what they've changed about the item, like how it works now, and where you could potentially get your hands on it. So first off, the Butcher's Cleaver is an ancestral unique axe, and it is something that can be found up to 925 item power now. And if they ever do increase the item power limit, I don't know, but maybe we'll see one day. This is the patch 1.5.0 version, by the way. Now, one of the biggest things they changed about this is the implicit or the passive effect is now 175% damage to injured enemies. So a pretty big bump for damage to injured. Now, the problem with damage to injured is it doesn't really work against monsters that are obviously healthy. Damage to injured is something that only works versus monsters that are below, I believe it's 35% health. So they have to basically be at 34.99% health or lower, which will give you a pretty nice bump when the monsters are at low health, but for the most part, like for instance, if you could just one-shot the monster from full health, well, who cares? Usually, this only really tends to help versus monsters that are particularly strong, like bosses, because once the boss reaches that 35% barrier, you can dish out a much better damage for that time period. But it's not really like super amazing. We also have attack speed bonus on here of 7 to 9% now, and a movement speed bonus of 12.5 to 18%. On top of this, we also have a physical damage bonus of 62.5 to 85% additive. So we've got two different additive bonuses on here now, the damage to injured and also the physical damage. And on top of that, we also have this very interesting effect of 16 to 25% critical strike chance against feared enemies. And, of course, this is specifically because of the fact that the weapon has a special effect that fears enemies. 25% crit is a lot of crit. However, Diablo 4 is not a game that is shy about giving you exceedingly large amounts of critical hit chance. I'm not exactly sure why. I don't exactly know like what the hell's going on with the game in terms of like critical strike chance, but it feels to me like critical strike chance is everywhere. You can get it from just about like any item aspect. It's like just thrown at you in so many ways that a lot of the times you end up with some exceedingly high critical strike chance bonuses. And although 25% is a lot, don't get me wrong, if you already have like 75 to a 90% critical strike chance anyway, what's another 25 added into the pot? You get my meaning? Now, the special effect on this is that Lucky Hit, critical striking an enemy has up to a 100% chance to fear and slow them by, and they bumped it up significantly, of 61 to 90% for 4 seconds. Now, if we go ahead and put this item on, I can play around with it real quick, and we're gonna have some fun with it. But it also has a special effect which says a nightmarish amalgam of blood, bone, and steel. This axe is as horrific and as deadly as its creator. Of course, it's referring to the Butcher, which, by the way, the Butcher has a lot of new. He's got a lot of new creations most recently. Like, for instance, he has the iteration inside the new Infernal Hells. The Burning Butcher is in there now. The original Butcher's Cleaver actually dropped from him, and that was actually where I got my first Butcher's Cleaver, was from the Butcher. It also has a very interesting graphic, as you can see here. It's like an axe with a like spine and like kind of like a goat man. It looks like a goat man skull or something like that. And of course the blade is embedded into the spine and overshadowed by the goat man. Ooh, sorry about that. I don't know where that came from. So when you're attacking with this particular item, basically what happens is you have a chance to cause the monster to be feared. I've never seen a training dummy get feared before. That's hilarious. I didn't know the training dummies could turn. That is absolutely hilarious. I was unaware that the training dummies could move at all. That is so cool. You learn something every day. Now, granted, when the monster is feared, you get 25% increased critical strike versus them. They're also going to be slowed, which is very nice. And they're going to be slowed by up to 90%, which is a pretty hefty slow. So the monsters aren't really going to be able to get away from you as easily with this particular item. And similarly, with Diablo 2, there is an effect called the Grim Totem. And the Grim Totem has a very similar effect such as this, where basically what it does is it slows down the monster and it also fears them at the same time. And it's not quite as bad as you would think. I know a lot of people see that fear thing and they immediately are like, okay, well, this is absolutely terrible because who wants the monsters to run away from you? Well, when the monster is slowed by 90% and they're running away from you at an extremely slow rate, it's very difficult for them to actually get anywhere. As you can clearly see, like, even when they are feared, I can literally just, like, walk behind them as if, you know, like, as if to say, like, where are you going, buddy? Where are you going? Are you leaving me? Where are you going? Where are you going? You leaving? Where are you going? Where are you going? And so adding the two together is actually a lot more impactful than you would think. Because, of course, not only are you getting the fear effect, which is going to apply as a crowd control, but you're also going to get the slow effect, which is also going to apply as a crowd control. And the two together are going to equal a monster that is basically not going to attack you anymore. And on top of that, it is also going to have issues, of course, running away from you. So it's running away from you at a very slow rate. And of course, you would probably want a 90% here to make sure that they're running away as slow as they possibly can. And this means that you're just going to have monsters that are just kind of like useless and they're not doing anything. You can also utilize this to your advantage because there's a lot of things within the game that require the monster to be crowd controlled, like crowd control damage, or when the monster is crowd controlled, gain extra damage reduction, or when the monster is crowd controlled, gain, extra damage. They recently added back one of the Season of the Malignant powers, which was called the Creeping Death. And the Creeping Death also has an interesting effect where it enhances your damage over time effects by the number of crowd control effects which are currently affecting a target. I want to bring that up real quick so you guys can see it. And the aspect of the Creeping Death, you deal 20% times increased damage over time to enemies for each different crowd control effect they are afflicted by. Unstoppable enemies are staggered. Bosses take 40% times increased damage from overtime effects from you instead. So, for instance, in this particular case, because of course this is applying both a fear and a slow, you're going to get an additional 40% times multiplier by using the aspect of the Creeping Death with a damage over time build.
Mr. Goody Two Shoes, Mr. Goody Two Shoes. Ginger Evil Mentor here. Why bother farming when you can go to MMOEXP.com and simply purchase your items in gold? GGM would have you farm the items. What a pathetic being. Use code GEM Ginger Evil Mentor for 6% off your entire purchase. And don't tell Ginger Gaming Mentor that I was here.
So it's interesting to consider that there are options with this particular weapon that could potentially allow you to get some pretty interesting damage. The fear effect isn't quite as bad as you might think, and the buffs that they made to the weapon have actually made it kind of a powerhouse in a lot of ways. One of the main issues, though, is that the Butcher's Cleaver, unfortunately, does not have access to any of the tempers that people would like to have access to. For instance, if I head over to the weapon tempers and we take a look, obviously I have things like chance for sever projectiles cast twice, sever size, reap duration, bone splinters cast twice, bone spear cast twice, bone spirit explosion size, minion attack speed, chance for skeletal mages to attack twice, and so forth and so on. And a lot of this stuff is obviously going to be missing from this item. Even when they updated it after the unique item pass, they failed to add any kind of like double attacks or anything onto this, and so it doesn't really stand out in that way. Now, because it is a single-handed weapon, you obviously can, of course, still equip it with a focus of some kind, or a shield if you're a necromancer, or a totem if you're a druid. And they've really opened up a lot of these unique items to be equipable by obviously more than like one or two specific classes. So as you can see, I'm on a necromancer right now, and I, of course, have the Butcher's Cleaver equipped. which is something that was not possible before because a lot of the items were locked to specific classes, like, for instance, the axe. Now, the Butcher's Cleaver does come from a specific place other than the Butcher himself. So if you are interested in picking yourself up a Butcher's Cleaver, you can always head over to Diablo 4 life, and I'm going to show you this, of course, this time. But if you have any other items that you want to look up, I mean, it's very useful. There's a target farming unique tool on here, and of course we have Butcher's Cleaver. And we click on Butcher's Cleaver, it's going to tell us that the Butcher's Cleaver comes from Grigore, and it also comes from Lord Zir, and you can basically find it on any character now, as opposed to just simply like, the specific characters that it used to drop for. It is available on all characters now, I think, except for the... Actually, I don't even know. I can't remember if the rogue and the sorceress can get access to the axe now. But I know the necromancer, the druid, the barbarian, and the spiritborn is going to be locked to staff and glaive, which is going to be different. But definitely a lot more options to get your hands on this. In fact, I wouldn't really foresee that you would have a hard time finding even maybe like a 4 greater affix version of this. And that's kind of something that we might want to consider here, is that that 25% critical strike chance that's on here, if you had a greater affix version and you masterworked it, that 25% could easily become a hell of a lot higher than 25%. Let's take a quick peek at a calculator here, and let's see if we can figure out what that might possibly be, right? So even without the greater affix, which I don't know exactly how much the greater affix gives. Actually, how much does the greater affix give? Diablo 4 greater affix. What is the greater affix exactly? So the greater affix is a 1.5 times multiplier on the ability. So we're going to take our 25, multiply it by 1.5, which gives us 37.5, and then we're going to add 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60. So 60% plus 25, which is 70, 85, plus another 25, which is 90, 100, 110, plus another 25, which is 135%. I think that's the correct amount anyway. So 135%, 35%, which means that you could potentially have like greater affixed and triple masterworked, maybe like somewhere around like an 80% critical strike chance. Of course, this is just table cap napkin math. Don't take this, to heart. But still, a very, very large amount of bonus here. In general, when it comes to the critical strike chance, you could potentially be using this to completely and utterly fix any critical strike chance that you have on your character, except for against bosses. And that's, I think, the biggest issue, is that it doesn't really work very well against bosses. Now, obviously, the critical strike, the fear and the slow is going to give you a rather large amount of staggering against the bosses, because you're going to be doing a pretty huge amount of crowd control. And if you were to tie this together maybe with something like Fist of Fate, which also applies random crowd control, between the Butcher's Cleaver and, of course, the Fist of Fate applying random crowd control effects, I think you could probably stagger bosses almost instantaneously. Could be really interesting to see, like, just how fast you could stagger a boss. Like, if you really set up for just the most ridiculous amounts of stagger possible, what could you achieve? And I think the Butcher's Cleaver might be a part of that equation, because, of course, it has a 100% chance to fear and slow, which is 2 crowd control effects, which would be applying essentially all the time. And if you've never seen crowd control effects, or like tested essentially how stagger works in Diablo 4, I actually have a video if you guys are interested. It's up on my channel. It's basically stagger testing. How does stagger work? And this video has been up for a little while, and we go over essentially all the different forms of stagger and like which ones are more powerful than others, how much they add to the stagger bar, subsequent staggers and how it reduces that reduction. Like, for instance, once you stagger a boss 4 times, it becomes infinitely more difficult to stagger the boss, around 90% more difficult to stagger. And so it could be interesting to see if potentially, like, using, say, a Butcher's Cleaver and maybe Fist of Fate, along with some other ways to put various, crowd control effects on a boss, to try and, like, set up a situation or a system in which you could stagger a boss as fast as humanly possible. And if you could potentially stagger a boss in the 4th stagger phase, because the first phase doesn't matter, it's super easy. The second stagger is super easy too, and the third stagger, while it's a little bit harder, it's still pretty easy. The 4th stagger is the one that matters, and it doesn't get any harder than the 4th stagger, so you have to set up a build that would be able to stagger that 4th stagger bar almost instantaneously, which would be pretty difficult. And I really do think that the Butcher's Cleaver is definitely a part of that equation in getting a build that can potentially stagger enemies with or bosses extremely fast. And here's the interesting thing. If you did set up a build that could potentially stagger bosses that quickly, well, then the critical strike chance would work again. Because when the monster is in the staggered state, the critical strike chance is still going to apply because the staggered state counts as all forms of crowd control and would allow you to get your critical strike chance bonus. So essentially, you would just be building a build that would permanently stagger bosses and obviously also benefit from the critical strike chance on the weapon. I think that's pretty much it for the Butcher's Cleaver. It's definitely a very odd weapon. It's not really one that makes it into a lot of builds, but it is memorable to me because it is the first unique that I ever found in Diablo 4. At a time when we were told there were no uniques in the game even. And everybody was super surprised that I had one. They're like, what are you talking about? They said there was no uniques. And, well, there is. There was. I found it. Haha. As always, I do appreciate you guys and gals joining my videos, even when we're just talking about the changes in patch 1.50. And be sure to hit that like button and the subscribe button if you enjoy the content. And as always, keep watching.